Hello, welcome to my interim review. My name is Thomas Rowntree. So before I begin to present the sequel, it's important to dive back, do a little previous and look at the sequence, which is the movie that comes before this one. So the sequence begins in exploring the movement on my site and following research into Bernard Schumi and how he breaks down movement into the plan, the event and the movement within the plan. I decided to create my own rules to break down the movement on my site. So I decided to break down movement into direction, speed and time, and using film as my medium of study, and also using film framing as like an anchor throughout the whole project. I applied film editing techniques to break that information down, which allowed me to create a field diagram, which then leads me to the sequel. So the sequel is a thesis that aims to explore how we can speed up or slow down the rate at which ex-convicts can reform using sequence of spaces and film framing. It's a bit of a mouthful. So to begin, we need to get the correct backlighting. So my initial research dives into Dilys Scofidio, and before I discuss the Slow House, which is one of his main projects, it was important for me to understand his process before I could then study his projects. So three things that they study a lot is the cut, mirrors and hinges. So they describe cut as a snapshot and is considered as cutting through time. Their work uses mirrors and instruments to reveal something and create virtual scenes. And then they also describe hinges as anchors of rotation. So then to look at the Slow House, it is a weekend house that follows a curve which uses a hinge as an anchor to create these sequence of spaces that follows. The hinge allows for a melodic sequence of spaces to form, and it also creates a rhythm throughout the spaces. So understanding how they use this anchor to create these sequence of spaces was really important to begin my project, and understanding how I could create my own anchor to create my own sequence of spaces. So as I began to do some research into ex-convicts, I understood that 63% of ex-cons re-offend within the first 12 months, which is quite staggering. So I decided to set up a 12-month timeline which would describe the ex-convict's journey back into society, with each month becoming a space with different stories. So I wanted to create this timeline which would have 12 pretty much sequence of spaces, and different events would happen along this timeline, kind of like what would happen within that 12-month of them trying to find their way back into society. So using the field formed within the sequence, I created a journey that would then become the timeline. And though the timeline is set, the spaces that follow the timeline would change depending on the stage that they are on across the 12 months. The spaces could change in width, height, and the angles could alter the speed that they move through spaces. Diversions could also provide a choice for what route they want to take. So whether they want to go faster through a space, they can maybe take a diversion, or whether they want to go slower through that space, they can take a different diversion, or maybe steps could slow them down, or ramps could speed them up. So using these methods to speed people up or slow people down as they walk through the spaces. So using a 90-degree hinge, we could also look at how we could have vertical timelines as well as horizontal timelines, following my research into Dilys Scofidio, and this led me to discussing what would actually happen along this 12-month timeline and what events would actually take place which would represent their journey. To begin, obviously they would leave prison, they would leave their cell, and so the entrance to the building would be the dimensions of a cell. So it's if they're leaving that, and they'd firstly enter this space where they can see this kind of really open, bright space which represent freedom, but they don't know how to get there, so they'd have to take this diversion round. They then enter a space which represents between months 2 and 5, which would be this really confusing, meandering journey, which would represent their kind of confusing journey back into society. So there'd be level changes, width changes like I mentioned earlier on. They'd reach a kind of point of reflection, so they can reflect on themselves, they can reflect on how far they've come on their journey, and this would also look back onto my research into Dilys Scofidio and how I could actually use this room to create virtual space. And then the second half of the journey is all about them making the choices of what they want to do. So maybe they can come off this path and enter these garden spaces, maybe community spaces, and they have the choice of which spaces they want to go into. So it's that whole idea of that when they're back in society, they have the choice of what they want to do. They have the choice whether they want to go back to prison or they want to do kind of stay on their path and get to the end. So I began to use models to understand how you can break these spaces up into frames and whether these would actually be boundaries or openings for each space. I then began to test geometry, looking at how these level changes would happen, how these walls may be angled, maybe there's some more narrow walls, maybe some taller walls, which would obviously change the atmosphere within the space. And then I began to do some more backlighting with some more research into the Labuse Woods, and I studied the War and Architecture book, which is a book that explores the destruction of buildings in Bosnia during the war, and he believes that their form must be respected as integrity, and he provides new spaces named the scab and the scars that follow natural stages of healing and marks of pride that cannot be erased. So within my thesis, I wanted my building to be a monument, which would take pride in the timeline, it would take pride in the ex-convict's journey, and it could also maybe go through existing buildings, which would kind of poke into reality along the way. So these ex-convicts have moments of looking into reality, looking at existing working environments, existing living environments, and that can act as a point of education. So I began to draw how these spaces would work. So this is just a quick sketch, and then I began to make some models which would look at how this monument would actually go through the existing buildings, following Labuse Woods research. And then following the research into horizontal and vertical timelines, I was looking at how we could create level changes vertically as well as horizontally. This model here, which you can see the level changes and how this journey can go along, and then it can go up a level, it might go under a level, it might come up even higher. So then I began to sketch out some more floor plans, understanding how this meandering journey would work, how these diversions would work, and then looking at it in section, how these level changes would happen, perspective, and then elevation, at looking at how this, how my monument will actually hit the existing building, will actually come out, go back in. So this elevation kind of shows that. And then beginning to look at the framing aspects, so bringing in the framing from the sequence back into my design and using it to kind of create this sequence and this framing of spaces, which would then become sections, and also moments for lighting, etc. So I created this model here, which is basically all the framing. So from my sequence, I broke down the movement of a person into individual frames, and then that is then translated into these slits that would form this outside curve of the building. And then this is when I began to make a digital model, which created a framework for these frames, looking at how I could then create these kind of modules, which would then come together as kind of like a front wall, a roof, and a back wall would be in situ concrete. And these diagrams here show that. And then this begins to explore those framing and how I could actually then represent the work at the end, because obviously it's all about film, it's all about the framing. So I want to do 22 sections, which would represent the 22 pieces of legs that are walking through the frame. And then this is kind of the floor plan that I'm at currently, which is, it needs to be edited. I know what I need to do to it, because in some areas it's just a little bit too clustered. So I know what I need to do to change it. I feel like I need to spread the frames out a little bit more, because at the moment they're all a bit cramped in the middle. And then this is basically setting up how the 21 frames is going to look. So I'm going to have all these kind of like window points, these frames, which are going to have a section at each point of the building, following these kind of cuts through. And then structurally, it's in situ concrete, and then along the timeline, each frame is going to be a module that will come together. So that could either be done off-site, I'm not really sure, I haven't really thought about that yet. And then the detail on how my building hits the existing building, and that just shows that basically my building will be supporting the top of the existing building, and then I've basically just moved the floor plate back within the existing building with a column. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Thank you for listening, and yeah.